So I want to welcome everybody this evening to an event that's very close to my heart to learn everything that we need to know about HPV. My name is Caroline Carrington, and I'm a certified neo-tantra teacher that is passionate about getting people out of their heads and into their...
I think we lost her.
Oh, maybe we're coming back.
She might be coming
Caroline,
back.
You're muted.
Thank you. Great. So let me just spotlight us again to make sure. And there we go. I am coming to you live from Mexico, so sometimes we have to be in the flow with technical difficulties. So, as I was saying, my name is Caroline Carrington. I'm a certified neo-tantra educator who's passionate about getting people out of their heads and into their bodies to connect more deeply with themselves, their partner or partners, and the divine. I'm based between California and Baja California Sur in Mexico. And I'm really honored and delighted that we have Mara Roy Carpenter here with us today to help us understand more about HPV and how we can make responsible choices for ourselves, our friends, lovers, and even our families. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Carolyn. It's really a pleasure.
Well, we were talking about this in advance, and I always hated when hosts like read, and it sounds very clinical in terms of introducing somebody. So I'd love to hear in your voice, just speaking to, you have quite an interesting background. So share with us how, what brings you to today to be able to share with us about HPV and how that connects to the rest of your work in the world.
So I'm a scientist by training. I have a Ph.D. in molecular and cellular biology. While I was in graduate school, I actually studied HPV. So I worked in a laboratory looking at how the body develops immunity to HPV, sorry. I also worked in HIV later. And we're discovering how the body creates immunity to HPV. And right now we're hearing a lot about COVID virus and the different mutations. And so what I studied was the mutations on the surface of the virus of HPV. So that's what I did in graduate school. And it's a topic I'm still very passionate about. I've since moved on from being a scientist, and I'm a relationship coach and sex educator, and I do teach breath work, body work, and neo-tantra, similar to Carolyn, but very different style. And I'm very passionate about spreading information and knowledge about HPV because it's a very misunderstood and not understood topic. It's kind of like the sleeper STI that nobody knows about, even though it's very, very prevalent. And while it doesn't usually cause trouble for most people, it can lead to some very serious consequences, which is why I'm really passionate about educating people and just getting the word out there about it.
Well, I love that you have this crossover between the sex positive world and the science positive world. And just to share a little bit personally, I remember when the Gardasil vaccine first came out. Wow, now I'm really making it controversial. We talk about vaccines within the first few minutes. But I, as a polyamorous person, my partner, who was my husband at the time, actually encouraged me to get the Gardasil vaccine. And when I did my research, I was a little concerned about some of the things that I saw coming up. And then more recently, I now have a teenage son, and it was his time to get his shot. And I'd actually had other friends of mine really express concern because, I'm sure we're going to talk about this, but things like anal cancer can arise from HPV. So anyway, I went into this big exploration. I went and did my own research, and then I went to Facebook. I'm like, I'm going to ask about HPV on Facebook, and I just loved how intelligently you wrote, and you actually really convinced me in the moment, to go and take another look at the vaccines and just to see that things have actually changed quite a lot. So that's part of what inspired this conversation. And also as a personal piece, I remember being 23, living in London, so I was away from my family in South Africa, and after an abnormal pap smear, I had an OBGYN tell me I had cancer. Now, I've never had cancer, I'm fine, but it was really frightening to me to get told potentially, this like life-altering news, and it was very confusing. And then I've also struggled with like, what does, given the prevalence of HPV, what does one disclose and what doesn't? So as somebody who's very committed to safer sex, I love teaching safer sex in my workshops. Given that I have multiple partners, it's really essential we do that. So I'm very excited to find a sex-positive molecular biologist in our community that can come and talk without us feeling like we have to walk on eggshells, Can't always speak so openly. So that's some of what the skin that I have in the game. And I know you've actually prepared a lot for us. So before we dive even deeper, can you share with us a little bit about like what HPV even is, perhaps how it presents, like how one would even know that we have it, because we don't always know we have STIs. And let's just take that as a jumping off point.
Yeah, most people actually don't know that they have HPV because it's largely asymptomatic until much, much later if you're unlucky enough to get cancer from it. So I'm actually going to jump in and start sharing the slides that I prepared because that's a perfect jumping off point. So we might as well go for it. So I prepared just a few slides to share tonight. There's a lot of information as we go along. Just feel free to ask questions if you need something to be clarified or something's not clear. You can put your questions in the chat, as Carolyn mentioned. You can message her privately if you want to be anonymous, or you can chat to everyone. So I'll be going through these slides just to give everyone an overview of what HPV is, how it's transmitted, what you can do about it, if you choose to do something about it. So we'll just jump in and then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So don't worry. So it's a short presentation, fairly short. Let me just start that. Oh, I lost it. I'm gonna pop it back up. Give me just a second. Okay. All right.
I keep muting myself. We always get
Can you see my screen?
Not yet, no.
Did it pop right up? Oh, how weird. Maybe I should not have started it first. Let me escape out of that. Hold on.
Okay. So
it just,
yeah, I just
the joys of technology.
We can always be experts at what, like I'm pretty good at teaching Neo-Tantra. I'm pretty good at working with trauma survivors, for example. I tend to attract a lot of them in my practice as a trauma survivor myself. But we're not trained on all the tech, right?
No, we're not. Okay, I'm going to go through and do it now. It was just, I'm working with multiple screens, so that's my issue.
No worries.
Okay. There we go.
There we go.
Can everyone see that?
Give a thumbs up or perhaps chat to me if you can't see. Great. So we can see your screen, and you may just want to put it in slideshow mode, I'm assuming.
Your hands. Oh, I noticed the recording just stopped. Okay, great. Here we go. So as I was saying, there's more than 100 subtypes or strains of HPV. It's very, very common. HPV-1, for example, causes innocuous warts, if you've ever had any warts on your hands, even as a kid or as an adult, they're caused by the HPV virus. There's a subgroup of the 100+ viruses, 36 of them to be exact, that are sexually transmissible. And they're transmitted through genital, oral, or anal contact. And one of the kind of misunderstandings or common misunderstandings about HPV is and I'll talk about this a little more on a future slide, but it's transmitted by skin-to-skin contact. So you actually don't have to have penetrative sex to transmit HPV. You can just be rubbing skin against skin, and that's how it gets transmitted. So most people don't know they have HPV. Most people are asymptomatic. There's only 2 types of the 36 that are sexually transmitted that cause a visible change, and those are the 2 that cause genital warts. So genital warts are also caused by HPV. And then there's another 14 strains. There's 14 strains that can lead to cancer. And I'll be talking a lot more about that in later slides. Most HPV infections go away on their own. That's a question I get a lot. But the ones that tend to hang out for longer are the ones that you need to worry about, because those are the ones that might cause cancer in the future. And there's no cure for HPV. This is often a kind of misinformation out there that there's a cure for it. But if you get warts, the warts can be treated. And if you get cancer, the cancer can be treated and hopefully cured. So let's see. So how common is HPV? It's actually the most common STI in the US, but most people have never heard of it. It's kind of like the most common STI that you've never heard of. It's at least 75 to 85, depending on what data you look at, % of people have been exposed to sexually transmitted HPV at some point in their lives. So probably on this call, all of us have been exposed. There might be one person maybe that hasn't been, but we probably all have been. So I just want to normalize that it's very common. It's quite unusual to not be exposed to it. The only way you can not be exposed to it is to have very few or no sexual partners. And then 50% of Americans have it at any given moment. So I said it doesn't always persist. Sometimes it goes away, but kind of at any given time, the data, it's 40 to 50% of people have an active infection at any given moment. And then this is a really great image, a great slide that I stole from the CDC. There's a link to the source there if you want to check it out for yourself. Just showing the prevalence and incidence of HPV. So the prevalence is the dark green bar and the incidence is the light green bar. And the difference is prevalence is just how prevalent is something, like how many people have a certain disease. And the green bar is how many people got it just in the last year. So how many are like recent infections versus ongoing infections. So that's why, you can see, like, for example, with like chlamydia or it's on the rise. So there's more recent infections than there are ongoing infections. And it also doesn't, go on forever and ever. So, so you can see that HPV is incredibly common. It's way more common than herpes simplex virus. So about 42 million people in the US have it. So it's very, very common. And then I mentioned that it's spread by skin-to-skin contact, but you don't need penetration to spread it. And condoms actually help, but they don't prevent HPV. And I have this kind of, I kind of comically put up this little picture of these condom shorts, but that's basically what you would need to prevent the spread. Because as you can imagine, if you're having penetrative, penis and vagina or penis and anus sex, you could have a condom on, but if you're really going at it, there's going to be skin-to-skin contact on the outer edges of that condom or at the base of the condom. And I actually used to teach female physiology and gynecology at the college level. And there's lots of pictures in gynecology textbooks of a ring of genital warts around the base of the penis because that's where the condom stopped. You know, so then your doctor's saying, good job for wearing a condom. So unfortunately, condoms don't prevent transmission completely. They do help. So most people don't know they're infected. And as someone mentioned, when we started the call, when we were chit-chatting at the beginning, women are tested for HPV, but men are not. So that's one of the things that makes it challenging for people to even know if they have it, right? Because if you're a male-bodied person, you're not being tested. And the only way you would know that you have it is if you have female partners who then test positive and then tell you about it. Women are tested regularly during their pap smear. The pap smears only happen every few years in the United States because that's the recommended frequency. I always argue with my doctors. I'm like, I'm a polyamorous sexually active person. Like, can you test me every year, please? I don't want to be tested every 3 years. So you can argue with your doctor about it and get tested more frequently. So I like to tell people that because that's, you know, people don't always think that that's possible. Your doctor may or may not do it. It's up to them. And then most people are not aware of HPV or its risks. They don't know their HPV status just because there's misinformation or maybe they're not tested. I've heard of doctors telling people not to disclose it because it's so common, but we can get into that in the Q&A. I do not agree with that practice. I think I covered everything on this slide. So what happens if you do get HPV? Like I said, most of us have probably had it at some point. Probably some of us have it currently, just based on statistics. Most likely nothing will happen. So that's the good news. It's statistically, you know, it's not like everybody who gets HPV gets cancer. I don't want to scare everybody. It just increases your risk. So most likely nothing will happen and you'll be asymptomatic. You could get genital warts, but the warts can be treated. They're either frozen or burned off. They can also be surgically removed. I know men who've had this done and it's not very pleasant, but it will remove the warts. And then the bad news is that you could develop cancer. And typically cancer from HPV develops 10 to 20 years after the initial infection. So it's usually a long ways down the road. So, you know, people like, once you test positive, you want to be monitoring and checking for cancer in the future. That can be shorter if you're immunocompromised for some reason. So you could get cancer within just a few years if you're immunocompromised. Usually the body clears HPV infections within months to 2 years. So 90% of HPV gets cleared within 2 years. But sometimes it sticks around longer. And the longer it sticks around, the more there is risk of getting cancer. And if someone has a question about this, we can geek out about it later. There's some geeky molecular biology as to why that happens.
Can I just interrupt because I feel like this is important. Just to understand, when you say it clears, does that mean the body is no longer HPV positive or the symptoms are not presenting? What does that mean exactly? Because I think this is where some of the gray area starts coming in for people.
It's thought that the body actually clears the virus. So it's not like a herpes virus. The herpes virus is different in that it hides out in the nerves and it kind of hides from the immune system and it can't be completely eradicated, which is why once you're herpes positive, you're positive. You know, and herpes 1 likes to live in the nerves of or am I going to get mine backwards? Yeah, in the nerves of the mouth. And then herpes 2 likes to live in the nerves around, you know, the genital. And then other herpes viruses like chickenpox is actually in the herpes family of viruses. It is a herpes virus, technically. It hangs out in the trunk of the body, which is why people get shingles when it comes out again, because shingles typically happen on the back or the trunk. So it's not like herpes. It can actually get completely cleared. The virus can be cleared out of the body. So then you wouldn't be able to infect other people, right? The problem is it's not really known, you know, like why some people clear and some people don't. And it's not really, and it is possible to miss. Like when women are tested, there are false negatives. So, because the way the test is done is you have a cervix, the back of the vagina, and they scrape some cells off and they look at those cells to see if they have cancer. That's what the Pap smear test is. But they also take some of those cells and they send them off to a lab and they look for virus DNA, for HPV DNA from the virus. And that's how they detect HPV infection. And as you can imagine, since it lives in the skin, it's not like the whole cervix necessarily is covered with virus. There might be a little patch over here, a little patch over here. And if they sample the wrong part, they might say, oh, you're HPV negative. But if you've had it before, you know, that's why they recommend if you're a woman and you're getting tested regularly, you really want to see like multiple negative tests. Then you can be like, oh, okay, I probably don't have it anymore. It's probably gone. Does that answer your question?
It helps and it adds more questions, but I'll hold them for now.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions at the end. If you have had a positive test or you're the partner of someone who's had a positive test, the ways to reduce risk are abstinence, of course, always an option. Not always a fun or great option, but it is an option. Another is just to really be diligent about using your barriers. So gloves, dental dams, really make sure that condom's like rolled all the way down, you know, like, you know, and if you use toys, I think toys are great because you can cover them completely with, you know, a condom. I sometimes put like 2 condoms on, depending on how long the toy is. And of course, toys can be sterilized. So you can always like sterilize them between uses. So those are good ways to go. Anyone who's been exposed to HPV should be monitored more frequently for cancer. So once you have a positive HPV test as a woman, they move you from that every 3-year testing to every year testing. They'll actually start testing you yearly. They should, that's the protocol. And then of course, if you do end up getting diagnosed later with an HPV related cancer, then it needs to be treated like any other cancer. So, and actually, I didn't mention it in the intro, but my area of specialty science-wise is actually oncology. So I know a lot about the cancer part of this too. Okay. So HPV causes about 36,000 cancers each year in the US. That's a US number. That's a number from 2018. And I want to point that out specifically because the numbers are actually dropping with the uptake of the vaccine, which is the good news. Like fewer and fewer HPV related cancers are happening. So every year that number is getting smaller. It was 36,000 in 2018. I think 2019 was 33,000, and I haven't seen data since that's more recent than that come out of the CDC, but I'm sure that it's coming. And 3% of all cancers, so like if you think of all the cancers that happen, is caused by HPV. So it doesn't cause a huge amount of cancer, but it does cause a significant amount of cancer. And what I'm showing in this slide, these are US numbers from the CDC, is there's 6 types of cancer that are caused by HPV. And the little percentages in the orange circles are what percent of that cancer are caused by HPV. So you can see almost all cervical cancer, 91 is actually a low estimate. Some people estimate as high as 99% is caused by HPV. It's almost exclusively HPV. It's very unusual to get cervical cancer without having HPV. Same with anal cancer. Anal cancer is largely caused by HPV. And then oral pharyngeal, which is basically all oral or head and neck cancers. So, you know, in the mouth or the tongue or, you know, anything around the mouth structures, 72% is caused by HPV. And that's been rising since they've been tracking it. And the numbers are how many total total cancers per year are caused by HPV. So for example, in 2018, there were about just over 12,000 cervical cancers, 11,000 of those were caused by HPV. So that's what the black numbers are. Okay. So I get asked a lot, like, well, how do I know if I've had HPV, if I'm gonna get cancer or not? The short answer is there's no way to know. There's a lot of factors that factor into whether or not that will happen. The more sexual partners you have, the more likely you are to have HPV and to have multiple infections of HPV. So that will increase your cancer risk. How long it takes you to clear the HPV infections also will affect whether or not it will eventually go to cancer. Your immune status. So as you can imagine, I mean, this is true for anybody. It's easier to get any kind of cancer when your immune system's not working well, whether there's an infection involved or not. Being HIV positive increases cancer risk from HPV, not only because of the immunosuppression, but also because of because certain types of infections can kind of support an environment that the HPV can grow in. And one example of that is chlamydia. So there's actually data showing that chlamydia bacteria help HPV grow and hang out on the cervix. That's been pretty well documented. So if you get a co-infection, like you have chlamydia and HPV at the same time, then that will also increase the likelihood that it could go ugly on you later and turn into cancer. And then smoking and alcohol use will also increase the risk of oral cancers from HPV. It used to be that kind of all like mouth and throat cancers were caused by smoking and alcohol mostly. It was like really heavy smokers, really heavy drinkers would get those types of cancers. And now the majority of them are caused by HPV because people are smoking and drinking less, but they're having more oral sex. So that's just been a societal shift that's happened, and that's why it's shifted that way. But if you do have oral HPV, not smoking and not drinking can really help not have it turn into oral cancer. And then it also depends on which strain you got infected with, because certain strains of HPV are more likely to cause cancer, some are less likely to cause cancer, and some are not associated with cancer at all. So, and I'll talk a lot about that in, I think, the next slide, or 2 slides maybe. Okay, oh, next slide, perfect. So I mentioned that there are 36 sexually transmitted types. I've listed them all here. Like I said, they're, you know, very uncreatively numbered. That's how they're named. So you don't need to memorize these numbers. Don't stress about it. I just listed them here for people who are curious about that sort of thing. And about 45% of men and 40% of women have one or more of these in any given year genitally, the 36 types listed at the top of the slide. And about 12% of men and 3% of women have one or more of these in a given year, like in their mouth, so orally in their mouth or throat. And there are 14 specifically high risk types, so a subgroup of that group on the top of the slide. So I've listed them there. And a smaller number, 25% of men and 20% of women, have one or more of these in a given year in their genitals. But what that means is that, you know, 1 in 4 men and 1 in 5 women is walking around with a potentially cancer-causing HPV type. So, you know, that just gives you an idea of kind of how common it is and the scale at which it's out there. And then I mentioned there's 2 types that cause genital warts, and that's 6 and 11. And there is a low cancer risk. I get asked a lot if there's an overlap between the wart causing kind and the cancer causing kind, and there is a low cancer risk with 6 and 11. They do find 6 and 11 in people who have cancer, but it's much lower risk than what they call the high risk types. And type 16 and 18 you might hear a lot about, because 16 and 18 cause 70% of cervical cancers. So it's mostly 16 and 18 that are the bad actors. Okay, let's see. So it's just a little bit more about just how, just kind of the scope of the impact of HPV. So cervical cancer is the 4th most common cancer among women globally. It's the 9th most common in the US. And this is something Carolyn and I talked a little bit about when we decided to do this talk, because you know, a lot of people, it is pretty easy to treat in the United States if you catch it early, because we do pap smears and we do screen women regularly. But in a lot of places in the developing world, women don't get pap smears. And by the time they're diagnosed with cervical cancer, it's a very sad situation. So, you know, there's a big kind of public health implication of the push to try to eradicate cervical cancer worldwide through vaccination, which is something I'm going to talk about next. And 1/2 to 1/3 of women with cervical cancer will die of it. I like to remind people of that. I know it's a sad thing to think about, but you know, if we catch it early and treat it, then it's not a big deal. But if it goes untreated, it can have really dire consequences. So HPV vaccination could prevent more than 90% of cancers caused by HPV. And we could, I mean, the way they talk about eradicating COVID or eradicating smallpox, we could literally eradicate cervical cancer. Like, if we could imagine a world where there's no cervical cancer, that would be pretty amazing. And anal cancer as well, since most of it's caused by HPV, and a very large chunk of head and neck cancer, throat cancer. So vaccination is the best protection against HPV. As I mentioned, you know, condoms help, but don't prevent spread. And, you know, there's kind of abstinence and vaccination. The vaccine that is used in the US, there's actually only one. There's 3 vaccines globally that are used, but there's only one that's available in the US, which fortunately for us is the best one, or the one that covers the most strains, because the other 2 are older vaccines that only covered 2 of the strains, and then 4 strains, and then the newest one, which is called Gardasil 9, covers 9 strains. And I bolded on this slide the strains that Gardasil 9 covers. So of the high-risk types, of the 14, or the, how many are in here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Yep, 14 types that are high risk for cancer. It covers 5 of those, or wait, no, 7 of those, sorry. 7 of those. So half of them are covered by the vaccine. And it also covers the 2 that cause genital warts, 6 and 11, that have some cancer risk. And you know, I often get asked, well, what about the ones it doesn't cover? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't cover all of them. But fortunately, some of them are quite rare, like 39, 51, 56, 59, 66, and 68 are not very commonly found. So they're not out in the world being transmitted. 35 is fairly common, not as common as 16 and 18, which are the most common ones. So 35 is really the one, like, if you get an HPV test, or a partner of yours gets an HPV test, you really want to ask your doctor, like, what type do I have? And, you know, if it comes back as one of the bolded ones, 16, 18, 31, 33, 45, 52, or 56, then you know, oh, okay, great. This is something the vaccine might be able to prevent. But if it comes back with 35, it's just, unfortunately, you know, the vaccine is not going to protect against that one. And there are many, many, many studies that have shown that vaccination reduces rates of HPV infection, HPV-related cancers, and genital warts, which is actually why they initially started vaccinating only girls, and they started vaccinating boys because they were like, well, you know, men get cancer from HPV too, and genital warts is a pretty big thing. Let's see. Oh yeah, and I mentioned earlier that total HPV caused cancers are declining in the US because of the vaccine. So it's 45,000 in 2017, 36,000 in 2018, and 33,000 in 2019. So you can see it's actually declining quite rapidly due to vaccination. Vaccinations recommended. I'm just going to check the time. I feel like I'm just talking like crazy. Vaccinations recommended for children typically, and as Carolyn mentioned, we started talking about this because she was trying to decide whether or not to have her son vaccinated. And the recommendation for children, for those of you who are parents, is between the ages of 9 and 12. And if you start your vaccination young, you only have to get 2 shots. It's 1 shot, and then the next shot has to be somewhere between 6 and 12 months. And if you're over 12, then it's recommended as 3 shots. So you get your first vaccine, you get the second one 1 to 2 months later, and then you get the third one 6 months later after that first shot. And I just want to remind everyone that vaccination prevents new HPV infections, but it won't treat, existing infections or HPV related diseases. So it works best if it's given before sexual contact, which is why they give it to children in that age group, because the thinking is, if you get them vaccinated before they start having sex, then they'll be protected, because it's so common, right? The thinking is, well, once you get out there and start having sex, you're probably going to encounter it very quickly, if not the first time. So, and I put together, I think this is the last slide, just some points about older folks getting vaccinated, because this is probably the thing I get asked the most about, since I think, none of us are 9-year-olds on this call. But in October 2018, the FDA expanded the approved age for the HPV vaccine up to 45. And that's a very significant thing, because it basically means that your doctor has to give it to you, your insurance has to cover it to whatever extent they cover those sorts of things, because it's an FDA approved vaccine. And most sexually active adults have already been exposed to HPV and possibly to more than 1 strain, although it's very unlikely that you have been exposed to all 9 of the strains that are in the vaccine. Like, you would have to be real busy and really active, like really active to even attempt that. So, at any age, having a new sex partner is a risk for getting an HPV infection, because it's so common. It's just out there, it's just out in the field. So doctors are often resistant to vaccinating you if you're over 25 for a number of reasons. So I just wanted to share those with you, because people are like, I argued with my doctor, but they told me I didn't have to get it, or they told me I was too old, or they told me I was already exposed, and so it wasn't going to help me. What the doctors are doing is they're making a lot of assumptions. And a lot of those doctors do not hang out in sex positive communities. So they're assuming that you're monogamous. They're assuming that you've already been exposed to HPV. There's actually data that shows HPV new infections are really high in like 16 to 25-year-olds. And they're also really high in 50 to 60-year-olds. And I had a friend ask me, like, well, why is that? Why is there this like bell curve where it's like really high, it's like a reverse bell curve, and then it's kind of low for people in their 30s and 40s, and it goes up again? And he asked me, does that have to do with biology? Does it have to do with their age or their immune system waning? I said, no, it has to do with sexual habits. I said, monogamous heterosexual people in their 30s and 40s are usually monogamously married and having children if they choose to do that. They're not out having multiple sex partners. Whereas later they tend to get divorced and rediscover their sexuality in their 50s and 60s, and then they're out having a lot of sex again. And that's why, there is no biological reason why that curve is that way. It just has to do with behavior. So there's a lot of assumptions your doctor is making about your lifestyle and your choices that are going into their, arguing against you getting the vaccine. There actually is good data of benefit in up to 45-year-olds, but some doctors aren't aware of that. That's why the FDA extended the age because of the good data. There is no good data in over 45-year-olds, but that's because nobody's researching it. I mean, to be blunt, they've kind of written all of us off. I'm over 45. They've written all of us off like, oh, well, you've already had all your HPV, and so you're either going to get cancer or you're not, and too bad for you. So, but the good news is there are places you can get vaccinated. I personally was vaccinated as a over 45-year-old. I paid out of pocket. The pricing varies depending on where you are, but it's not a cheap vaccine. I had to pay $600, so $200 a shot to get vaccinated over 6 months when I did it. But I have heard from folks that Planned Parenthood will do it. They might bill your insurance. I don't know what they charge, if they charge, but often depending on your income level, you can get free services from Planned Parenthood. So that's one place I would look if you decide you want to try to get vaccinated. I've also had Kaiser members report, many Kaiser members in the Bay Area report that they'll cover you at any age. If you just say, I have a bunch of partners and I really want to get vaccinated. I think they have enough sex positive docs there who are like, okay, this makes sense. Like, you probably should get vaccinated. And the beautiful thing about that is then Kaiser will cover it. I haven't heard of anyone having to pay for it if they get it through Kaiser. I'm a little jealous. I'm wishing I had, been at Kaiser when I got vaccinated. I wouldn't have had to spend that $600. So that's kind of the pieces about vaccination. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions, but I'm just going to stop there. And this is my contact information. You can reach me at mara@revelationships.com. And I'm also on Facebook at Revelationships. And if anyone has any questions they're too shy to ask tonight or lingering questions later, you're welcome to reach out to me through Facebook or through my email. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Wow, thank you. This was really good with all the data and everything that was on the screen, because otherwise it can get a little bit complicated to track everything. I know I had some questions and participants have been asking questions, and I have no doubt that there'll be more. But I'm just checking in. So, and forgive me if I'm asking like really basic questions, but if you get diagnosed with genital warts, it sounds like that means you have HPV, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I know earlier on in the call, people were talking about HSV, and we've talked about HIV. Those are totally different. HIV, I think most people know what that is. But HSV, I've done another video on that, but that's to do with herpes, which we've touched on today. But the focus is on HPV. So just, I know there was some confusion, or it seemed like there was some confusion at the beginning. So I'm curious, and this has been an inquiry for a long time, how is for people with pussies, if you are getting regular smears, let's say it used to be every, I think, 2 years, now they've made it every 3 years in the US, but if you're getting a regular pap smear, what is the advantage of getting the vaccine? Because won't the pap smear catch, if you've got HPV, won't it get caught on that in the smear versus in the pap smear versus having a vaccine?
Okay, that's a good question. So the pap smear is screening for cancer, and then there also is an HPV test that's done at the same time. They're two separate tests. They're always done together now. They didn't used to be, but they're always done together kind of when you get your sexual health exam as a pussy haver. But the vaccine will protect you from future infections. So any infections you've had in the past, you can't be protected from. But as I mentioned, the vaccine covers 9 different strains. So you probably haven't been infected by all 9 strains. So the vaccine will help you develop antibodies to any strains that you haven't encountered before in the wild. Does that make sense?
Any of the 11
or am I being
strains,
confusing?
or the 9
Any of the
strains?
9
9
that are in the Gardasil 9 vaccine. Yeah.
I'm good at many things, numbers. I'll be going over your
it's a lot of
when I watch the replay.
It's a lot of numbers.
Okay, so you're saying because you may have been exposed, but only to one particular strain, having the vaccine will help you to be protected from, the other 8 potentially. Okay.
Exactly.
And then I know I asked you this in advance, but I did have an irregular. I'm being very forthcoming now, talking about the details of my pap smears. Anyway, I did have irregular, or whatever they called it, abnormalities in my pap smear, and they did like a LEEP procedure. For those of you who don't know what that is, many pussy owners, that becomes interesting in a kink context. Anyway, people that have pussies can sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Getting all distracted with pussy owners. So they have a LEEP procedure when you have abnormal pap smears, and they'll just like take a little piece where the abnormal cells were found and cut it off. That's layman's terms, but anyway, and then in theory your pap smear should go back to normal. But I heard from my OBGYN the last time I went that actually they were doing a lot of those in the 90s, and mine happened outside of the US, and they were doing LEEP procedures on people that didn't even need it. So this could be a way actually to prevent surgery from happening, because my doctor was like, well, you may not have even needed that at all. So this is another reason, for example, where a vaccine could really help you, so you don't have to go in for this uncomfortable.
That's a great point.
Thing. Okay. And then people are asking, are there tests to see if you have HPV in your throat or anus?
Yeah, I think I had this on my slide, and I think I must have skipped over it. I'm sorry about that. Unfortunately, there are not tests outside of research setting. So people who study HPV will get groups of people enrolled in their studies, and they'll test them, because you can do like an oral swab or an anal swab like you can for other STIs, but it's just not done routinely. It's not available. I actually did some research when I was prepping for this talk, because I was like, maybe there's something new I don't know about. And I found that there is a company that claims to do oral HPV tests. So it's like an oral swish spit test, like you would do for DNA testing, like the kind of thing you'd do for 23andMe or any of those other companies. But it's a new company and it's not approved by the FDA. So I would say proceed with caution if you do something like that, because it may not be very accurate. And the last thing you want is a false positive and go running around telling all your partners you have oral HPV when you don't.
Don't. Okay, so this comes back to the next question, because I've literally had doctors tell me, and I'm noticing like just a little bit of shame coming up. I don't disclose. So back in I was 23. A doctor literally told me I had cancer. I didn't have cancer. I had some abnormal cells. Anyway. And I've checked with doctors in the past, and they've said, oh, no, you don't have to disclose that you've had HPV, right? So to be really just in integrity with everybody, there are other things. I'm HSV2 positive, so I disclose that every time. But do you see where it starts getting a little bit confusing? Because the doctors are saying one thing. They're like, oh, well, everybody's got it. They said that about herpes as well. They're like, oh, don't worry, it's benign. I disclose that anyway. But given that the prevalence is so high, and also from what I've understood today, it is not a life sentence. It's like after, I think it was 5 to 10 years, it can work its way out of your system. So this whole piece of if you've had a positive diagnosis, what do you recommend as a way, firstly, should we be disclosing to partner or partners? And secondly, like how long, and what is the ethical way to go about this, given that I'm imagining most people on this call are pretty sex positive to begin with and want to do the right thing, but the information's really confusing.
Yeah, it is really confusing. And I've heard lots and lots of stories of doctors telling people, you don't need to tell your partner. It's so common. It's so common. Everyone has it. Don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. Which in one hand, you can be like, okay, that kind of makes sense, right? And the doctors don't want everyone to freak out. right? People hear the word cancer and they freak out. And it's not a death sentence. It's not a guarantee you're going to get cancer. It just means you now have a higher risk, and you just need to, keep watching and make sure you don't get cancer. But me personally, I mean, I'm not going to tell other people what to do, but me personally, like, I want to know. I want to know if someone that I'm going to be interacting with is HPV positive, because then I can control, I might make different decisions about the types of activities I want to do with that person. I might make, I, for example, have never tested positive for HPV, which, given how prevalent it is super weird, right? I'm like, how did this happen? But, it's entirely possible I had infection when I was young and it went away really, really quickly, like in a couple months, and they never caught it. So I was never positive. It's highly unlikely that I've never had it, just statistically. I'd have to be a weird statistical anomaly. But I mean, that's another thing is, I think the reason why doctors say that you don't need to disclose is because, it can go away in a very short period of time. It's 90% go away by 2 years, but sometimes it goes away in 2-3 months. So if you're only getting tested every 3 years, you might getting infections and then they're being cleared, and then they're testing for is an active infection. They're actually testing for viral DNA. They're not testing for like your antibodies against. And I think with COVID, a lot of people understand the difference of that these days. Like, there's like the COVID test and there's the COVID antibody test. It's like they're doing the actual test for the actual virus. They're not looking for antibodies.
So the questions are going to keep coming. So I'm going to keep peppering you with them if that's okay. But
yeah,
when somebody gets oral or anal cancer, do they then test to see if HPV has caused it?
Yeah. So if you get oral or anal or cervical cancer, they should be testing your tumor to see if it has HPV in it. Well, HPV genes in it. I don't know how geeky we want to get here, but after the HPV, the reason why cancer happens later is after the HPV is long gone, while it's around, which is why how long you have it is one of the factors in whether or not you get cancer. While it's around, there's a certain probability that it can actually like insert a piece of its genome into your cell. And if it does that, it actually puts in a cancer-causing gene. And depending on where that gets put in your genome, it can then turn that cell into a cancer cell. So, so that the virus can be long gone, but it might have left a little present behind in one of your cells. It might have left a little piece of its DNA. So that's part of why the cancer happens so much later, and why the vaccine, once that's deposited, is not going to help you, right, from that particular infection. It'll help you from acquiring future infections.
And if
does that make sense, or was I being confusing?
No. For me, that could help, or that helped. So I've got questions coming at me left, right, and center, and I'm trying to talk and read them at the same time. If somebody, let's say somebody years ago, like in the 60s, or I'm not as old as that, but like in the 80s, that's still a long time ago, but had a presentation of warts, but then had negative pap smears after that, can we assume, and I know we're focusing a lot on the pap smear, but that's really the main way to find out information, right? So if you've had negative pap smears since then, can you assume that the HPV has worked its way out of your system?
Well, once you've had an HPV infection, you should get screened regularly. Like, you should do pap smears regularly for a while. And then the infection may be gone, but the cancer, if there's a cancer risk, that's kind of been set already, if that makes sense. Like the virus, it kind of shows up and it leaves. And if it happens to deposit a present in one of your cells, a not nice present, then that cell can become cancerous. And whether or not it becomes cancerous depends on a lot of factors. Like, does your immune system take it out first before it can start growing? Did the present get deposited in a place where the package can be opened or not? if the package can't be opened, I'm using an analogy here, but then it's cool. It's like, it's just there and nothing's going to happen. So that's why you can't really say, like, for any individual person, like, how likely am I to get cancer from any one HPV infection? Because it's a bunch of different probabilities, like, multiplying on each other. And they're all small probabilities. So again, I don't want to scare people. Like, as an oncology expert, people are always like, oh my God, cancer, 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 we're all going to die. And it's like, well, no, actually, fortunately, it's very common, and it's not very common to get cancer from it, but is something that can happen. And people can protect themselves by getting vaccinated and by being aware and by sharing their status with their partners if they know it. So that's why I'm pretty passionate about sharing all this, because we can all do something about it. And we might even be able to eradicate cervical cancer. Like, I don't have children, but if I did, I personally would vaccinate them, because knowing that, like, my daughter is probably never going to get cervical cancer, doesn't even have to worry about it, would be pretty amazing.
Does it though? Because I wondered this when Gardasil first came out. Like, do you think that then stops people from going to get their pap smears, which is looking for more than just HPV? Because they're like, well, now I have my Gardasil shot, so I don't have to worry about that.
Well, there are the strains that aren't covered, even though they're less commonly transmitted. And there are a small number of cervical cancers that happen without HPV. So it won't completely go away, but it will be much less of a thing. And I mean, cervical cancer is pretty easy to treat if you catch it early. And usually the outcomes are good. Like, it's not going to take your life if you catch it early. Whereas head and neck cancer, I do a lot of work with head and neck cancer patients. I still do some oncology work now, and it's just heartbreaking, because they're like, oh, you're cured of your cancer, but you can't eat and you can't swallow, and you're totally disfigured. Your face is completely disfigured. So it's a really horrible life to have to live, right? It just, like, breaks my heart. So if you can avoid that, I personally have several older male friends who have HPV oral cancer, and one of them is not with us anymore, but so unfortunately. And HPV, I often get asked why HPV oral cancer is more prevalent in men than women, and again, it's just behavior. There's more oral sex. There's more, like, giving oral sex to pussies done by men than by women. I mean, it's just a behavior thing. Like, there tends to be more, just because of that kind of heterosexual bias in our society, right?
And speaking of biases, one of our participants asked, and this is somebody from outside of the US asking, is it still the case that the HPV strain distributions are different for people of color?
I don't know about that. That's an excellent question. Now I'm going to go look it up.
Can I jump in?
Sure. Yeah, okay. Definitely. I will just say one thing, that it is true that people of color have higher rates of HPV in their communities, and they also have higher, like, worse cancer outcomes, but that has to do more with racism in medicine.
Cancer outcomes part. This was my question. And the way that it used to be a few years ago when I looked into this was that it seemed like the prevalent available vaccines were targeting, unfortunately, the strains that are most common in not persons of color distributions, and that persons of color have a different prevalence distribution of those variants of the 130 plus HPV that we have now. And I was just wondering whether the vaccines are hopefully getting better at hitting distributions of everybody, not just quote unquote white people.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And thank you for bringing it up, because
thank you.
Most studies, like clinical studies, are done on white people. It's a huge bias. They're also usually done in men. So there's also a gender bias as well. In medical research.
Oh my God. And
We can talk about that for another 3 hours.
For penis owners, there isn't an accessible test unless you happen to be having a lab and a virologist nearby.
Yes. Or if you have warts, I will say I have known men that have had warts, that have had them removed and tested, that have asked the dermatologist to not, you have to ask because they look at you funny, but you can actually, right, if you have warts, have them tested to see which strain you have. Although, honestly, I don't know what it will tell you because you either have 6 or 11 if you have warts, and we know they cause cancer at a very low rate, but much lower, right, than some of the, right, other cancer-causing strains. So it's probably not going to tell you much, honestly.
On that note, I was actually tested when I presented with a wart, and it took me a while. And, you know, again, perhaps TMI, outing myself a little bit, but the physician was like, I can't even see it. What are you talking about? And I'm like, it's huge. And he's like, let me get a magnifying glass. And I'm like, great, thanks. And he's like, nope, still can't see it under the magnifying glass. And I'm like, and he's like, all right, 2 choices. Burn it today, wait 6 to 12 months to see a dermatologist, and they're going to burn it. What would you like to do? And I'm like, let's burn it. So we got out the liquid nitrogen and we burned it. And then he's like, oh, look, now that it's frozen, oh, I can actually see the pattern now. Yeah, that was a wart. And I'm like, okay. And so that was as close to a assessment that I got. And it's one of those, yeah, I've made the choice. I disclose that to anyone so that, you know, they can be in choice. And if it's going to be an issue, that we know it sooner rather than later. And even though I haven't had an outbreak in 10 years, I'm like, I can't say that I can't because I barely noticed the ones that were there. And I can't say that I'm not asymptomatic. And so, yeah, anyway, thanks so much.
Yeah,
thank you.
They can be quite small. And I mean, oftentimes women who have genital warts don't know they have them because they can be internal. They can be inside the vagina and or even way in the back. And if you're not, you know, doing your own self exam and checking that out, you're probably not going to see anything. And again, as you said, they can be very, very small.
Right.
So if you're looking, you might not
feel it before I could ever see it. Right. And when I got a second one, I actually let it grow larger just to see. Right. And then went back to the same clinic and we removed that one as well. But it still wasn't anything to like, I've had people say, oh, I'd have to do a visual inspection. And I'm like, this doctor that sees people at the San Francisco clinic every week and was like, chill, everyone has these, don't worry about them. Was very nonchalant, but he understood when I insisted that I wanted it burned off. He's like, most people don't even know these are there and they're hard to see for people that do it all the time. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. I just want to make sure we've got others that have been waiting patiently as well. So I want to make sure we get to their questions. One of our other participants was asking if they do carry HPV, should they expect to get penile cancer, and should they be screened for anal cancer as well?
Well, first of all, penile cancer is very, very rare. It's actually not a very common cancer, so that's the good news. I'm not going to put my slide up again, but there was on the slide I showed, I'm just clicking back to it so I make sure I get the number right. So 900 a year penile cancers, like in the whole US, caused by HPV. So I wouldn't be too worried about penile cancer. And again, the nice thing about a penis is it's out. You can look at it. If there's any bumps or lumps, it's pretty obvious. It's not an internal organ. So, you know, if any bumps pop up, definitely go see your doctor. Could be a bunch of things. And then in terms of getting everybody, I mean, the recommendation is that everybody should be screened for rectal cancer starting at age 50. That's just the general cancer recommendation. So if you're over 50, you should get screened regularly. It's just good self-care, healthcare. And fortunately, I'm not 50 yet. I disclosed that I was over 45, but I haven't crossed the 50 threshold. And I'm not looking forward to once that starts. But fortunately for those of us who are a little on the younger side, it's actually a pretty easy test. It's like a fecal test now. Like they used to actually like go up there with a scope, but now you just do it at home, and it's supposedly pretty easy. I'm sure there are folks on the call that know way more about it than I do. I've had to go through it. But you should get screened regularly, just in general as you age, because there's other things that can cause like rectal cancer and not just HPV, but the anal cancer at the very kind of very bottom part is what's caused by HPV, again, where that skin to skin contact might have happened.
This is a more general question, but I think it's really relevant. Do shaving or invisible shaving, does shaving or invisible shaving irritation impact transmissibility for any STI?
Well, especially for HPV, it does actually, because it's a skin-to-skin transmission. If you have little nicks or cuts or cracks in your skin, that's going to make it easier to transmit it. It will also make it easier for HIV because there's more, access to the bloodstream, since HIV is a bloodborne virus.
I literally had a partner, and when we would go to play parties, he consciously he would brush his teeth, but he wouldn't floss because he played with people of all genders and he wanted to be available for as much play as possible. So I really love that question, because we tend to forget in this modern world, like it's simple little things that you can do to take much better care of yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely not flossing will keep your mouth more intact.
Right.
Wait till later to floss.
And sorry, I'm just still mulling over this whole disclosure piece, because I really like giving people all the information so that they can make informed decisions. And like you were sharing, Mara, how then you might just make a different choice on how you play, or what, maybe you'll wear gloves and you weren't planning on wearing gloves. I have a lot of queer sex and play with people who have a lot of queer sex, and we love gloves. It's just fun. The gloves can even be quite a kinky thing to get into, if that's your jam. But so it sounds like it is important to disclose to your partners if you've tested positive. And that conversation can change if you've now had, I know after my LEAP procedure, I think they tested me for like a year. I had to go back every 3 or 4 months to just see what was happening with the cells, and eventually all my pap smears were normal. So, then life kind of moved on. But yeah, can you speak to that? Because I don't want people, there's already enough shame around STI disclosure, and you don't want to create extra worry in people. So would you explain how best to handle that as people? I'm hoping everybody who's here is showing up because they really want to be in integrity.
Yeah, I think it's a really hard question, and honestly, I don't have a good answer for that. Like I said, for me personally, like I like to know those things. But I mean, unfortunately, this HPV isn't something, because it's so common and because it's so asymptomatic, that we can really control like we can other STIs. The best way we can get control of it is to get vaccinated. So like, certainly I would disclose whether you're vaccinated or not. That might be something that would be important to disclose, kind of like what we're doing now with COVID, as we're opening up and people are saying like, it's cool, I'm vaccinated, do you want a hug? A lot of those types of conversations. So I think I would, encourage people to, if you choose to get vaccinated or not, to just disclose your vaccination status. I'm more interested in, like, me personally, I'm more interested in like, how many partners do you have on a regular basis? How many partners have you had in the last 2 years? Like, that's going to tell me more about your HPV risk than, because you may have an infection, but be between your pap smears and the doctors aren't even checking for it. If you're female, and if you're male, there's no way for you to know unless one of your partners tested positive and told you. So it's not really something we can control. And that is why doctors tell people not to disclose. So, you know, while I can kind of see their point of view, I don't agree with it because I'm a big proponent of disclosure and giving people as much information as you can and then letting them be in their own consent and their own decision making. But like I said, I wouldn't advise people one way or the other. And I should have said this at the beginning of the recording, but I am not a medical doctor and I am not offering medical advice. And please talk to your doctor about all of these things, including vaccination. But I do want to arm people just with some talking points when they do go talk to their doctor, because I know people over 45 particularly, and then even people over 25 get a lot of pushback because of kind of the thinking around it and the recommendations. The current medical recommendations.
You said in your presentation about how doctors assume you are monogamous, because I've had OBGYNs say that to me, and I was married at the time, but we were not monogamous. And there was such a strong, I actually left the practice in the end because I'm like, you're not even asking me. And I was having to advocate very strongly. And they're like, but you're married. And even in monogamous relationships, people cheat. I mean,
yeah,
you know, not that we're wanting that.
Yeah. I mean, I will, you know, out myself as being very pro-vaccine. I think it's probably obvious to all of you. So I think everyone should get back. If you're having sex, you should get vaccinated. That's my recommendation. But of course, it's your choice. And I know vaccination is a very personal thing. So I'm not going to tell anyone what to do.
Just for those that may be hesitant about the vaccine, we didn't arrange this. Somebody asked this in the marketing, like, did you arrange this because you want to push vaccines on everybody? And no, that is not why we did this. We did this so we could create more information for the community. And I really encourage you, because I was a hell no to the first version of Gardasil that came out for my body. And then I had to look at it again, you know, it was almost 14 years later, anyway, for my son. So actually go and do research, because the data changes, the science, and when I say the science changes, like we just learn more all the time. Because when I did the research, I was like, oh, this actually does look like a great example for him. And that wasn't my experience the last time I looked into it. So we're going to have time just for one or two more questions. So I want to queue up our participants. If they have anything else, this will be your time to take it. But I know, Mara, you have something amazing, an 8-week offering that you have coming up. So please share a little bit with our audience what you have in store for them if they want to dive deeper with you.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I just want to put out there again, I had my email in the slides. It's mara@revelationships.com. If you have any questions, like I said, I'm really passionate about this. I give these talks for free. I just like to share information. So feel free to send me an email if you want to follow up. You can also find me on Facebook at Revelationships. I have a private coaching practice. I work with individuals, couples, and groups doing sex and relationship coaching. We don't typically talk about HPV in my sessions, but I do like to support people. And I particularly focus on people with alternative relationship structures. So polyamory, other types of ethical non-monogamy, and as well as conscious monogamy. So that's really my focus as a coach. And I also teach breath work that pulls from yogic and tantric and modern modalities. And I'm a faculty at the New Body Electric School. If you haven't heard of that, Google the New Body Electric School. It's a great organization. They offer all kinds of courses online since COVID, but they will be teaching in person again soon. And then I also just have a new course that I just got up today, which is what Carolyn mentioned. And it's going to be an 8-week online course, 2 hours every week. And we're going to do a deep dive into the chakras. So we're going to spend a week on each chakra. So if you are interested in learning more about chakras and working with your own chakras, it's really going to be a deep dive into learning how we can learn about ourselves and heal ourselves through each of those energy centers in the body. And I'm going to put in the chat a link to that event. Oh, I sent it to Carolyn instead of everyone.
That's okay. Well,
there
as
we
you're
go.
doing the tech on that, if anybody in our that's with us live on the call still has questions, if you can put your hand up, if you can do it electronically, or ping me otherwise, so that I can know that you have a burner before we wrap up, because I do want to make time for that. And then also, if you have any feedback or something that you'd like to share with Mara before we wrap up, we can also make time for that. So I haven't seen any hands go up. So if you'd like to just share a gem, perhaps something that you've learned. I know there were a few ahas for me this evening already, or something that you're just going to take away that's a real treasure for you this evening. If you want to unmute yourself and just share, you're welcome to do that now. I'm going to make sure you're not all shy, I'm going to lovingly stop the video. Whoops, stop my video. No, not that button. Stop the recording.